Stephen MacKinnon is the government leader in the House of Commons, and he joins you now. Minister MacKinnon, good to see you again, sir.
So good to be with you.
Congratulations on going back to the old role. You know how to do this, so I wonder, Mark Carney says he wants to build at a speed that we have never seen. Not building a budget for this session. How beyond the tax cut, how significant do you think your agenda will be in the House this summer?
You mean the spring, up to the end? Up to the end of June.
When it gets over 20 degrees this summer, as an East Coaster.
It's certainly around here, around these parts, it does. It gets a little humid, inside and outside. Look, we're going to have a throne speech. It's going to be an ambitious throne speech, but not one I don't think that will surprise anyone, in as much as it will very much reflect the issues that Canadians voted on and voted for in the last campaign. We will obviously have a bunch of financial business to do. We will have supply votes that will, in full public view, represent the spending intentions of the Government of Canada. Of course, as you know, we will effect a tax cut for everyone who pays income tax in this country, a significant reduction in taxes. It's important to stress that because folks sometimes just gloss that over, but we are cutting taxes.
Yeah, it's a 0.5 percentage point on the lowest rate for the rest of this year and kicks into a full point starting next fiscal year.
But it's a significant savings. From July 1st, people will see it on their pay stubs, and a significant savings for Canadian families. Everyone who pays income tax will get a tax reduction. It's a significant affordability measure. It's a very costly affordability measure, but it's one that we ran on and one we think is very important.
Right, so obviously the throne speech is going to require the King's delivery, and they're going to require a vote. Supply is necessary, so you have a spending authority without a budget. The tax cut will be a piece of legislation, and I presume there will be something on internal trade, because there is a promise to eliminate federal trade restrictions by Canada Day. And it sounds like from what you said that this session will run probably just until the end of June. It will rise by Canada Day, and that's probably the entirety of the legislative agenda. Well, is that fair?
We're going to lay out some objectives. I want to communicate with my counterparts, opposition leaders, before I communicate on CBC airwaves, David. But we will absolutely have some legislative objectives, and we'll want to get those accomplished before we break for the summer. Okay,
but are we going to see some of the big items that were in your election platform, in this spring session of the House? Because if not, then that delays things into the fall. If some of these require a full budget to get there, which it sounds like we're not going to see until 2026, does that kick some of your agenda into the next year rather than really coming out of the gate firing right now?
Well, we identified some priority items. Internal trade is absolutely high among them. Some work on major projects. We have been talking, I think, very openly about border policies. We've been talking very openly about a tax cut. So these are all things that I think you can expect to see reflected in the throne speech, which we will debate and vote on, and perhaps some elements of those in our legislative agenda.
But there's about $35 billion in measures in your platform that were sort of promised for the first year. If we're not going to see a budget in this session, and we may not see one in the fall, does this mean individual pieces of legislation for each one of these? Like, I know you can't give me specifics because of contempt of Parliament, and I'm not trying to get you fired on your first week, but is that procedurally how we think you're going to proceed, or how do you see it?
I think you'll see ministers get their marching orders from the Prime Minister, from our platform, from the election campaign, and some of that work you'll see reflected this spring. I know this is being pretty vague, but I don't think anyone expects that our entire legislative agenda will dig into between now and the end of June. What I can tell you is that there are certain priority items that we have identified that will absolutely be the subject of debate in the House of Commons.
Okay, but should we expect a more modest legislative agenda, I suppose, in the month that is there? Like supply is going to take up time, the throne speech is going to take up time, and if it is just 4 weeks or so, there is limited runway.
Well, there's limited time, but of course the government will, again, go to those issues that we think are priority issues. We'll come back in the fall, obviously with a fall economic statement, with a whole bunch of other legislative measures that will reflect, again, what Canadians voted on and what Canadians voted for.
Okay, so in terms of how you're going to get this through the House, have you had conversations yet with the House leaders from the other parties?
I have.
Depending on where the recounts go, you could be right there, or you could fall back to 167 seats in this Parliament. What sense in terms of cooperation and the room for collaboration are you getting from the Conservatives, the Bloc, and the NDP?
Well, we are a minority government, and we will govern as if we require the support of some other set of parliamentarians for everything that we're going to propose. We fell short of a majority, but we feel we do have a mandate. And to the extent that other parties can identify with the priorities that we ran on and want to implement, then we will obviously extend that hand of cooperation, be open, have open discussions. I laid the groundwork for that with Madame Normandin and Mr. Scheer today in my talks with them, in my discussions with them. We'll obviously get more specific as we get closer to the date of return of Parliament, but absolutely door open for cooperation. And we know that we'll require their help to get some of these things across the finish line.
Door open for cooperation, but is there a door open for negotiation? Like, are there demands coming back? This is the way, I think, in the fall, right? There was a lot of horse trading and kind of ultimatums. Different political context right now, obviously, than them, but is that where it is, or is it, if we put this element from our platform out, can you support it? And this element, can you support it? How is that going to, what's the shape of it look
Well,
like?
everything's a negotiation.
Sure.
We know that. I'm used to that. I think Mr. Scheer, Madame Normandin are used to that. We have fresh memories of that. I want to reiterate, we do not have a majority, but we do have a mandate. And I think there is some convergence, both with the Bloc and with the Conservative Party, in terms of some of our objectives. We'll try and make good progress on that. I think they feel as much need to get results from this Parliament as do we. At least I'm hoping that's the spirit that they approach this Parliament with. And I'm very confident that we'll have a good working relationship, a positive working relationship, and most importantly, deliver some results for people who I think expect it.
You mentioned Mr. Scheer, you mentioned Ms. Normandin. You've not mentioned anyone from the New Democrats. I know they're below the official party threshold, but what's the state of conversations with them in terms of working together in this Parliament?
Well, I certainly intend to speak with Mr. Davies and with Elizabeth May as well. And with any parliamentarian who wishes to have a dialogue with me, I'll be happy to do that. The status of the New Democratic Party, you just described that. It is for Parliament. Parliament made those rules. If those rules are to change, Parliament has to change them.
What's your sense of the appetite for that? They did fall below that. The electorate did send them in with 7 seats, but it is a minority parliament, and there may be a need in all directions to cooperate with the New Democrats, and this may be something they would like to see. I mean, do you think there's an appetite in the new House of Commons to lower the bar for official party status, or is that just too much? Is that a dangerous precedent to set?
I don't want to speculate on that because it involves the opinions and positions of other parties. The Bloc Québécois, I know fell short during the 2015 to 2019 period. Memories are long in this business. The fact is, though, that there are 7 New Democrats. They are all experienced members of Parliament, and I look forward to working with them.
What's the Liberal position on that? Do you think, would the Liberals be open to giving them official party status or giving them some extra resources?
I think it's premature to have any of those discussions. I haven't even talked to Mr. Davies yet.
Okay. On Tuesday, Pierre Poilievre said he won't reflexively oppose everything you do. What is your sense of what that is going to look like? I know Mr. Poilievre won't be there for the initial period of time. Presumably he'll be back in the fall. You probably won't oppose him in the by-election. I don't know if Battle River Crowfoot is fertile ground for your party, but it seems like the leader courtesy might be extended there. What is your sense of just how cooperative the Conservatives will be in the wake of this election result?
Well, it may surprise you, David, but I actually have, very healthy, productive conversations with many Conservatives, as is often the case. Among House leaders, House officers. I know our whip will be talking to their whip. The hand of cooperation, the hand of dialogue will always be extended to them. We're going to take Mr. Poilievre at his word that he wants to get results for Canadians. I think he heard the same message that we did. Canadians are asking for action from this Parliament. We're going to give them a tax cut. We're going to give them movement on internal trade. We're going to set out a broad set of priorities in a throne speech that we hope will attract the support of Mr. Poilievre's party, and of other MPs and other parties in Parliament. So let's take him at his word. I am not here to poo-poo any of that. I'll take cooperation and support wherever I can get it.
Well, you're asking them for the support on the tax cut, and in round numbers is about a $5 or $6 billion hit to revenue, or benefit to Canadians, however you want to frame it. But they're being asked to do that, all parliamentarians, without knowing what the new financial projections are for the government, without knowing what the new economic forecast is for the country, because of the decision to wait.
Well, that's a
until the
little
fall.
disingenuous, as you know. There will be spending plans laid out. Parties will get to vote on specific spending plans by department, by vote.
Right, but I asked the finance minister when he was here yesterday about updated deficit numbers, updated economic forecasts, all of these things, and we have to wait until the fall with the fall economic statement. So I wasn't trying to be disingenuous, but we will not have official numbers from the Department of Finance. This is our projection. I mean, that puts parliamentarians in a bit of a difficult spot, right? Being asked to vote on a multi-billion-dollar item without knowing where it fits into the full picture.
Well, you're going to have a broad statement of political and policy intention in a throne speech. You're going to have a detailed set of supply votes. We are going to propose a tax cut. We will be dealing with the parliamentary prerogative in terms of funding the government of Canada in full view, and then come back in the fall once Mr. Carney, who has been Prime Minister for 6-8 weeks, but really with a mandate for 2 weeks. And we'll have the reflection of Mr. Carney and the government's thinking with respect to the budgetary way forward. I know that's something that he will be spending an awful lot of time on with Mr. Champagne and with the rest of our colleagues. And I think Canadians should feel very, very reassured that this is going to be a government focused on the economy, on jobs, and yes, on fiscal matters. So I think people should be very reassured by that.
Okay, I have one last question for you. In the last Parliament, things near the end, government business couldn't get done because of the privilege debate over the I know there's disagreement on the merits of the motion, but the government's refusal to comply with a House vote to disclose certain documents related to the Environmental Development Fund. Did Mr. Scheer indicate to you whether those privilege motions will be coming back, or will government business be able to proceed when this Parliament comes back, or have you agreed to comply with it?
That would be that is not a topic that we discussed.
Okay.
It would shock me, frankly, to see the Conservative Party want to return to those tricks. I know that they will have engaged in a process of examination of whether that was productive and helped their political cause. I personally don't believe that it was. I think Canadians will have very, very little patience with an obstructive set of circumstances like that. 3 months of Parliament being suspended, basically, where nothing can get done, and that going on in the full view of the public. I think that was not a productive period. I don't think anyone's particularly proud of that period from any side of the House of Commons, and I'm really hoping we can move on from that.
Steve MacKinnon, the government leader in the House of Commons. Appreciate your time today, sir. Thank
you, David.
We're going to get some opposition reaction. Ontario Conservative MP Adam Chambers joins me now. Adam Chambers, it's good to see you. Thanks for being here, sir.
Thanks for having me, David.
Your leader in your party has criticized the lack of a budget, saying it amounts to a lack of a plan. We do have a clear sense, I think, of the immediate priorities of the government. So is it really a lack of a plan? And what's your sense?
Well, David, first, it would be highly unusual for a government to miss a budget. You'll recall probably in the last 20 years, COVID being the only time when the government was unable to deliver a budget, and perhaps rightfully so in the moment. But we just had an election campaign where the Prime Minister and his surrogates were saying that it was the Liberals who had a plan. I think the Prime Minister said a plan beats no plan any day, referring back to a Churchill quote. And yet here we are, it's ready for prime time. Where is it? And what can Canadians expect with respect to this moment in time, which the Prime Minister also referred to as a crisis?
Right.
And not even 1 week ago, the Bank of Canada was ringing the alarm bells in a very rare but sobering press conference where it said, the economic situation is very uncertain going forward. So I think Canadians deserve to know the financial health of the government and see what proposals the Prime Minister intends to bring forward. We will have gone almost a year and a half by the time budgetary legislation comes forward in the fall if the government keeps to the timeline it's recently suggested.
Right. So Canadians need to know an update on the financial health of the government. You can do that without a budget, right? They could give us a fiscal statement, an economic statement in the month that Parliament's apparently going to sit. But they don't seem to even be doing that. I mean, would you accept a situation where you would get an updated set of numbers and then more of a budget-style document in the fall? Because the election was only 3 weeks ago. So there is a time constraint challenge here for the Finance Department at a minimum.
Well, I would say two things, David. First, of course, the throne speech would have elements in it that would perhaps also appear in a budget. That is normal. So yes, absolutely. I think the government has a point to make there. But I would say, again, they ran an election suggesting that they had a plan ready to go. The Department of Finance is filled with incredibly capable people who will have been working on a budget starting well before January, and then including the promises that the party made during the election. So my suspicion is that there is a budget basically ready to go. The question is, why is the Prime Minister deciding to not bring it forward now? The Prime Minister's also said that he'd like to change the accounting rules of the government. That could also be presenting a bit of a problem. But I think the Prime Minister is not getting off to a good start. He's setting himself up for a bit of a run-in, I think, with the rating agencies, perhaps with the Auditor General, and even in the Parliamentary Budget Officer, with respect to not showing just reasonable transparency in terms of the fiscal projections of the government. We're asking parliamentarians to vote on a tax cut that may cost the government upwards of $5 or $6 billion, but we don't know how we're going to pay for it. So, obviously tax cuts are good from a Conservative perspective, but we also said we had to look at the spending side. But these are things that discussions you would have with other parliamentarians after you see a budget and a proposed fiscal plan. So look, if the government would like to just show us a table of where it thinks the revenues are coming and the expenses are coming and how much we're spending on debt, that would be a fiscal update, if you will. I think that would be better than nothing, of course. Right. But I do think, the Prime Minister ran on having a plan. I think Canadians deserve to see what that is. But
you worked for Jim Flaherty, I think, when he was finance minister. Am I remembering that correctly? Before you were elected yourself. I mean, the election was April 28th. They're still counting and recounting and litigating some of the ridings. I mean, do you credit, like, if you won government last month, I mean, do you credibly think you could have a budget ready to go by the early weeks of June?
Well, David, I would make two quick points. Yes, I did work for Finance Minister Jim Flaherty, who was a great mentor to me, and I think one of the greatest finance ministers of my generation or our lifetime, frankly. But let's go back to look at what happened there. Federal election, government changeover in 2006, throne speech and a budget very shortly after the election. Election in 2008, throne speech, budget very shortly after the election. And by the way, 2008, during economic kind of upheaval. By the way, Mr. Carney was working in the Department of Finance at that time as well, so he's well aware of the planning that is already done by the department officials during an election. And the second point I would make is, this is a contrast that is appearing, and I'm not sure the Prime Minister is aware of the contrast that he's setting up. Pierre Poilievre said that Conservatives, if elected, and even in this current state, would be willing to work all summer to pass the necessary legislation in order to deliver the support, not just to Canadian families, but to the Canadian economy in a time of crisis. And Prime Minister Carney is getting off to not a great start by saying, look, we're going to bring Parliament back for a couple of weeks, and then we're going to break for the summer. But trust us, don't worry, we'll come back with some ideas in the fall. There are a number of things that require legislation. The GST cut for new homes, as an example, which Conservatives supported during the election. In fact, ours was beyond just first-time home buyers. That requires legislation. The personal income tax reduction requires legislation. Any changes to capital gains tax rates, which Conservatives also supported, also require legislation. If you think about some of the changes that people have talked about with respect to the Impact Assessment Act, which is the No New Pipelines bill, or other regulatory reforms, all of these things require legislation. It is a bit bewildering why we might not be wanting to debate and table those amendments, very necessary amendments to get our economy moving right now. I mean, time is of the essence. People are making investment decisions. I just think it's not a good look for the country or inspire confidence amongst investors, rating agencies, or just everyday Canadians.
Well, in 2006, if my memory, Stephen Harper was sworn in as Prime Minister February 6th. The budget was May 2nd. So if we do get a large-scale financial document from the Carney government in, say, October, I mean, it's not that different than those timelines, right? Doesn't it? If you're going to get some stuff in June, and then, September when Parliament comes back. I mean, who knows when the fall economic statement will come. And they're pushing into December under the last Prime Minister. But early in the fall, would that satisfy, do you think, if we get something like that, and certainly before Halloween?
David, we'll spend all day talking about hypotheticals, but let's see what the minister has said. The fall is the fall.
Sure.
So, this is a government who waited until the last possible day to table the public accounts. The previous government ended their parliamentary, reign, not abiding by House orders to produce documents, waiting until the final days to table public accounts, asking parliamentarians to vote on spending measures before even being given the closing of the books from the previous years. I think if Mr. Carney, or Prime Minister Carney, is trying to demonstrate a change from Prime Minister Trudeau's government, this is not the way that I would have recommended he start.
So a final question, or a final point to get into, Mr. Chambers, is your party has talked about reflecting and listening and changing. Will things change when Parliament comes back on the 26th? Parliament was pretty much gummed up because of this standoff over the privilege motion, over the production of documents for months and months and months during the last Parliament. Is that coming back? Do the Conservatives plan to bring back this demand for the production of documents that the RCMP has said it isn't the right way to do it, but the government clearly was violating the privilege of the House by not complying with it, but it led to this standoff that made Parliament totally non-functional? What's your sense of whether that issue resurfaces?
Well, David, I wouldn't prejudge any discussions with my colleagues or other parliamentarians. You'll recall that the House order included support from all other parties in the House except for the government. So, that would be a discussion for multiple parties to have. I would say, the government, if it was wanting to start off on a positive note, would either A, produce the documents that were asked for the last Parliament, or B, which is a suggestion I had made that they didn't take up on, was recovering the $400 million that the Auditor General said went to companies that were ineligible. Now, look, we just had an election. The public is interested in doing things that are for the benefit of all Canadians. I do think it is a disturbing pattern to have a Parliament or a party in the House of Parliament not comply with a vote of the majority of the members. So, look, it's an issue that is important to me, just as someone who believes in parliamentary supremacy. I'm not sure, that's the first thing out of the gate we'll be discussing. I'll leave that to the experts in the House leaders' offices and other parliamentarians. But, I am keeping it in the back of my mind as something to recall. And by the way, the Auditor General is the one who said that hundreds of millions of dollars ended up in companies that didn't deserve to receive it in the first place. So I think, this is an issue that's probably not going away completely, but I think the government could do a good faith effort by either producing the documents or recovering some of the funds.
Okay, well, we'll see what happens after the King has finished his speech on the 27th. Adam Chambers, Ontario Conservative MP. Good to have you back on the show, sir. Thanks for your time today.
I look forward to being back more, David.
All right, thank you. Okay, we're going to start there with the power panel. Cameron Ahmad was the head of communications to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And here with me in the studio, Kate Harrison is a Conservative political analyst. Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister. And Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. Good to see you all. Andrew, let's just start with Scott Moe there. Him and Daniel Smith, usually pretty aligned. They're right next door. Very different tone from the Premier of Saskatchewan today.
Well, it is, and I actually think it has to do with what our pollster friends have been producing in terms of information of just how far offside Scott Moe is with the Saskatchewan population. And I think, this is realistically, he got the memo. and started to realize that you cannot look like you are soft on separation in any way, shape, or form and expect to carry a mandate from the provincial voters. And I think that that's all that's happened in this. As much as he wants to cozy up, to his base, as much as he wants to deal with whatever threat the Buffalo Party or whatever iteration of that thing is these days, he still has to be, figuring out a way not to cede ground to Carla Beck and the NDP. And I think one of the things that was, really evident out of the polling is that there is an opportunity in Saskatchewan and Alberta for a very different set of voter coalitions to come together around the separation issue. If the parties are essentially moderate and in the middle on a lot of the economic pieces, if they agree on the grievances and the remedies for that, then the question becomes the litmus test on, are you with sovereignists or are you with Canadians? And that's, I think, what Scott Moe has got to figure out. And we'll see where it is in terms of where Danielle Smith lands.
Well, I mean, Kate, right now, certainly Scott Moe is siding with Canadians. And while he's had some of those Western grievances that we see, he's never really kind of put the integrity of the country sort of in the middle of it. And he is going to co-host the First Ministers meeting in Saskatoon at the beginning of June. So it seems like, despite some cabinet messaging incoherence yesterday, that Scott Moe does see a shift in a direction that he's at least taking as a positive sign.
Yeah, and I think part of it is the public opinion environment. Part of it is also a signal in a tone change from the federal government in terms of who they've appointed as the head of natural resources. I think the West, broadly, Saskatchewan included, is looking at Tim Hodgson's appointment with some cautious optimism, somebody that's going to bring a bit more of a private sector lens and perhaps a pro-development lens to the natural resource industry. And so I think it's appropriate for Premier Moe to be cautiously optimistic about that and signal to his constituents that we want to see some action as opposed to, right out of the gate saying that these guys are no good. Of course, that was muddled a little bit by Mr. Guilbeault's comments yesterday.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second.
I do hope we talk about, but I think it's appropriate for the Premier to be, again, approaching this in a way that suggests, they want to work together.
Mm-hmm. So, all right, I'm going to get the camera in a second, but Shachi, Andrew and Kate have both mentioned the public opinion environment. What do you think is happening in Saskatchewan that, has Scott Moe just, the election's over, Mark Carney won, let's all be first ministers and be responsible and work together? Or is there something nipping at his heels?
Yeah, for now, right? There's also precedent with new prime ministers for premiers to say nice things and make nice and try to lower the temperature. I think we are seeing that. I think Scott Moe I think Andrew nailed quite a bit of the internal or the provincial politics aspect of this. He also has the luxury of not having his right of center base split as badly as Danielle Smith's is, right? So he's got
Her coalition is much more difficult.
Much more difficult to manage, and she was the so-called unifying leader of the UCP, which means she has to keep that Wildrose coalition on side. Moe doesn't have to worry about that to the same extent. And he may be looking in the mirror saying, well, do I really want to be kind of the person and the actor in all of this who is giving gravitas, right? Oh, it's not just Alberta. Saskatchewan is making the same noises too. Does he want to be that guy right now? And for whatever reasons, I think in part because of some of the cabinet changes we've seen, in part because of some of Carney's own comments, the Prime Minister's comments, however reluctantly or defensively he made them, say, yes, okay, on a pipeline. Yes, we're going to get oil and gas moving. We'll see if it happens. But in the meantime, I think there's been enough signal for the premiers to say, okay, let's just let this breathe, let this ride. We're seeing this, hey, you've got Conservative MPs on your show again. Like everyone's being nice for a little while.
Yeah, well, we went through a wormhole on April 28th. I hear there's going to be a cabinet shuffle in Alberta tomorrow, so those things are very much in flux. Cameron, what's your thoughts on what we're seeing here? That it certainly, the cabinet table has been given accountability and autonomy, according to the Prime Minister, with a set of expectations. The First Minister's table has got expectations for him as well, but it seems like it's going to be pretty collaborative, at least for now.
Yeah, let's hope. I mean, these are the right signals from both the federal parties, but also from premiers. It's really most premiers, not all of them. It's really the only appropriate response when there's a new government. And let's not forget, we are in unusual times, to put it mildly. Everybody is talking about how important it is for the country to come together. That was Prime Minister Carney's his grounding message throughout the campaign. It's what he built his coalition on. This notion that the country is facing threats, facing challenges to our economy, to our sovereignty, to our the status quo of our trading relationship with the United States. It's time to come together. It's time to think about solutions that everybody can get behind. And he's just getting started. He's literally just named his cabinet. He's just putting forward his initial proposals. So the only appropriate way for really anyone in a leadership position to respond is to say, yeah, absolutely, let's work together. And that's how the Prime Minister so far has also messaged vis-a-vis premiers and vis-a-vis other leaders in Parliament. He says he wants to work with them. He wants to find common ground. So now is the time to not only signal that, but actually look for areas that they can work together in. So I absolutely agree there are political reasons why the Premier said these things, but I'm also hopeful that in this current context, it's actually how they feel and they're ready to give it a new shot.
I like how Cameron said these are unusual times, as if we've had usual times at any point in the last half decade.
The last 10 years.
Yeah, exactly. All right, look, I do want to talk a bit about some of the mixed messages, because Premier Scott Moe was also asked today about the mixed messaging coming from the cabinet about pipelines. And the Premier had this advice for the former Environment Minister and current Minister of Canadian Identity and Culture, Stephen Guilbeault. Take a listen to this.
I'm sure he's very grounded in culture, in where he lives and where he was raised in the province of Quebec. I would hope that he, in his portfolio, is very focused on, identifying, supporting, and understanding the entirety of Canadian culture, not just the culture in Quebec. And I would encourage that minister to get out and experience Canadian culture in its entirety.
Okay, he actually invited him, Kate, to like an ATV festival, which I would fly out there to cover that. But what do you make of this? So it's like Mr. Guilbeault did suggest that TMX is not a full capacity. Factually is correct. There is no proponent for a West-East pipeline, but I think there's maybe the hope for a proponent for the West-East pipeline that even the Premier of Quebec has suggested there might be approval for in his province, given what's happened with Donald Trump. What do you make of this dynamic that is playing out there? Because when I heard Scott Moe today, it seems like he's kind of pushing the Guilbeault comments to the side and putting more faith on the Prime Minister and Tim Hodgson.
Yeah, I think Mark Carney would like to push aside Stephen Guilbeault's comments about pipelines yesterday as well. Just supremely unhelpful. For that to be within the first 24 hours of naming the cabinet. One of the headlines that drove yesterday was a retread of, kind of failed policy and ideology from the previous government when Prime Minister Carney has been deliberately trying to carve a different path. So, I think the Premier is quite right. The Minister of Canadian Identity and Culture is not just a minister for Quebec culture and identity. And to come out so forcefully and say, no new pipelines, he took the most ambitious statistic possible in terms of reliance on bitumen to say, we're not even really going to need oil and gas in not that long period of time. It is the opposite, I think, of what the government wants to signal in these early days about getting energy resources moving and showing a demarcation from the previous administration.
So, Cameron, how do you deal with this if you're the Prime Minister's office, which is still in the process of staffing up? I mean, the Carney team has sort of been building the plane in the air since seeking the leadership, but this isn't one of his rookie ministers, right? This is the Quebec lieutenant and a multi-term minister saying this. I mean, when you were a DCOM in the PMO, this would have you have hair like mine if things like this kept happening.
Yeah, the first few days of a cabinet swearing in are always going to be difficult to manage when you have a lot of new people. You're right that he's a senior minister who's been there for a while, and it's not helpful to say things that are discordant with what the message from the Prime Minister is. Look, I think over time, they will figure out how to bring more cohesiveness to the messaging from all ministers. And it wasn't just him. There were other ministers who were asked questions that they weren't prepared for. Like, this is normal. It happens. It's not ideal. And it's certainly not what you hope, like what you plan for when you announce a new cabinet. And you have some messages that you want everyone to stick to, and you want everyone in the country to hear. At the same time, I will say, when we're talking about Canadian identity, of course, it is important for the Minister of Canadian Identity to reflect and understand the entire country. It's also important for everyone else in different regions of the country to do the same thing. And there are people in Canada, in Quebec, and across the country who do not feel the same way the Premier does about pipelines and fossil fuel expansion. there are people who believe that we need to. There are a lot of people who believe that we need to keep investing in renewables and we need to keep diversifying our sources of energy. So what the Prime Minister is signaling is, yes, we need to invest more in. We need to invest more in all forms of energy, but also expand our market access for our natural resources from Alberta and Saskatchewan. But there's a lot of other things we need to do when it comes to our energy independence and simultaneously our work on the environment, which is also an extremely important priority for him and should be for all premiers.
Right, but Andrew, stay in your lane is a very important principle in cabinet, right?
Indeed.
That if you're not the minister for a particular file, defer to the minister for the particular file, to use the Ottawa shorthand for issue. What did you make of what we saw?
Well, I mean, I agree a lot with what Kate said. I think that what you saw Scott Moe do was give them a pass on this. This could have been a much bigger issue. I think he kind of waved it off as, okay, well, we all know what Guilbeault thinks. Let's see what Carney thinks.
Right.
The problem, and I go back to kind of what Cameron was saying earlier, is that yes, it's a new government, yes, it's a new cabinet, but it doesn't have a honeymoon period.
Yeah.
I think that they have a grace period where there's a few months where they can kind of hammer stuff out, but this is a time when they should be building political capital, not spending it. And they can't afford, for a government in its fourth term, even with, under new management or whatever they're portraying this as, you can't make stupid mistakes because people are still listening to that, and they're really always listening to, did they change? And that's, I think, what's really going to be important here in terms of how this government communicates over the next few months, is are they demonstrating they actually got the message that the electorate sent, or what did they see this as just, hey, great, let's keep moving?
Yeah, and it's interesting, Shachi, the Conservatives in particular, and Daniel Smith, they keep coming back to Stephen Guilbeault. And I get their criticism there from their point of view, but a leadership change like this really does change the direction of the government, right? Like a lot of Pierre Poilievre's caucus before the last election were elected under Aaron O'Toole. It all functioned very different. It's pretty clear this government is going to function under Carney very differently than it did under Trudeau.
Well, I think the Canadian electorate wants to see that happen. They've given as much of a mandate as they were prepared to do to see that happen. But, in many ways, the country wrote in the history of big blank checks, the biggest, blankiest check to this government. And so they are going to be looking now for action, for movement, for emotion. And when you have not brand new, never elected before rookie politicians coming in, and, they're far more likely to actually have the message discipline and take the memo and say, I'm just going to go in with a big smile on my face and say, I'm here
I'm happy to be here.
Here. Let's roll up our sleeves. Let's get to work. Gregor Robertson is not a rookie politician. I don't know what he was thinking. Stephen Guilbeault is not a rookie politician. I don't know what he was thinking. Was there some sort of, is this all the internal machinations of, well, I'm going to get that out there and ensure that the cabinet table and my colleagues haven't forgotten this aspect of things? And yes, one of you made the point that in Quebec, Cameron, you talked about the fact that, there's still quite a bit of opposition in terms of tolerance for resource extraction, pipelines going through jurisdiction, et cetera. I would just make the point that we are seeing support in Quebec for pipelines at a level unprecedented. Never seen it before. 47% of Quebecers now saying this, almost half. Never seen that.
Well, it's an energy security question all of a sudden, right? Because Line 5 going through the United States, and you don't want to rely on American imports, all of these sorts of things. The Gregor Robertson thing, I think he was trying to thread the needle on a complex policy answer in housing, saying we don't need to collapse the housing market price, we need to increase supply, which would have a rebalancing effect in the market. But I think he's trying to reassure people whose retirement is invested in their homes that he's not going to crash the situation.
But I think going back to something you said earlier, this is a government that will function very differently. I think the jury is out on that because the 4 communications screw-ups yesterday were experienced politicians, 3 of whom have served in this cabinet since 2015. So, I mean, it's an open, I think Shachi's right. This is what Canadians want to see. They want to see a difference in the leadership of Mr. Carney. But to have headlines driven by experienced cabinet ministers yesterday that are completely off message with what he wants to put out there is not a sign to Canadians that there's going to be a change.
No, look, understood.
Well, just to that, David, just quickly to that. I mean, to your point, obviously, communications-wise, this is not what you want to see. Right? There's a bunch of different people saying different things, answering questions very quickly without having fully thought through, responses. But this is not the measure of whether the government is different or not. As you said, bunch of headlines driven by quick things that they said.
Yep.
The measure will be in the actions he takes and whether he is able to follow through on the promises that he made to Canadians in his platform, which will roll out in the next few weeks.
But isn't that the big
via a budget?
But isn't that the big question? And I think that's going back to the big blank check that's been issued. Ministers should be able to revert back to what the core message is, and I think they don't really know what that core message is.
Yes.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I think that's fair. But look, I'm not trying to cut this off because we'll
It's
come
your
back
show.
to it. No. Look, girl, I just got to put you on pause because we got to turn to Ontario because today, Kate, they have a budget. Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy tabled the province's post-election budget, a plan to address the economic pain of the trade war with the United States.
Ontario and all of Canada are at a precipice, and we need to take serious steps to make sure we do not find ourselves anywhere near the bottom. We will need to bolster our economy by investing in our powerful and promising industries, by building more, by building faster, and by protecting jobs and creators.
All right, the CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick. She's been on this all day for the CBC. She joins me now. Megan, good to see you. What does this budget tell us about the impact that the tariffs are having so far? Because the government got reelected on dealing with this. What's the fallout they're dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, the whole reason Doug Ford triggered an early election here in Ontario was because of the tariff threat, and he asked voters to trust him to be the one to respond to it. And today's budget is that plan, a plan to protect Ontario, it is titled. And David, I feel for the forecasters in the Ministry of Finance because this likely was a challenging budget to put together and to make projections given how much uncertainty there is around the trade issues, how much longer the current tariffs might last, if Donald Trump will target more sectors that would impact Ontario's economy, what the eventual impact will be. Nonetheless, they have come up with some numbers in this document, and there are some discouraging signs in it in terms of how Ontario's economy is doing. This year, economic growth is projected to slow down to just real GDP growth of 0.8% for this year. Unemployment projected to be an average of 7.6%. Ontario's deficit is going to balloon to $14.6 billion. It was only supposed to be around $1.5 billion, according to the last projection. And they are blaming that on the tariffs, saying the deficit's going to be that large because of a package of measures that they're willing to put out there to support the economy and to weather this storm. I want to point out that Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy was asked specifically in a news conference with reporters here at Queen's Park whether there could be a recession here in Ontario. He said he does not want to speculate. He said he is an optimist. And he said they are doing everything they can to avoid that and to immunize Ontario's economy and to lay the groundwork for economic growth. And he was trying to paint, as rosy a picture as he could with this situation, saying Ontario is well positioned to handle this tariff threat.
Right.
And the impact it'll have on the economy. But the document speaks for itself, David, in terms of the numbers.
Yeah, and the unemployment rate in Ontario is moving up. The manufacturing sector lost a lot of jobs in the last job report. So they may say it's well positioned, but obviously it needed more positioning. So how does this budget respond to all of the challenges presented by these tariffs?
Yeah, the response is kind of twofold. So there are some measures that are aimed at directly supporting workers and businesses, and then there are other measures that, again, are meant to stimulate economic growth and to make the economy more resilient. Now, one of the biggest line items in the budget in terms of responding to the tariff threat is something they're creating and calling the Protecting Ontario account. There will be up to $5 billion in this fund that is meant to support companies and workers, but it really sounds like a contingency fund. They're talking about people only accessing it as a last resort, and they were talking a lot about federal government programs and looking to Ottawa to see what it's going to do first before people here in Ontario would tap into this specific program. They're calling it an emergency backstop. And again, the finance minister saying, let's see what happens with negotiations between new Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Donald Trump over getting these tariffs lifted. So they've created that, but it's not like that money is going to be spent immediately. They are dedicating some money to workers who might lose their jobs directly as a result of the tariffs. And so that money will go into what are known as action centers. Often these are hosted by unions to help workers find new jobs, essentially, and other supports. They're going to put a lot of money into an existing fund. That's the Skills Development Fund. They're putting an extra $1 billion into it, topping it up to a total of $2.5 billion. So that's a significant amount of money there. They're creating a new program called the Trade Impacted Communities Program. That'll have $40 million in it, and that is for more municipalities and local communities who depend on a certain sector or industry that might be impacted by the tariffs. They'll be able to access some of that money to do things like diversify their supply chain and that kind of thing, so some money there. And a big emphasis in this budget, too, in terms of support for certain sectors. You might think it might have been the auto sector or the steel sector, big key industries that are already being impacted by the tariffs, but it's the critical minerals sector. They're creating a brand new fund to do with that called the Critical Minerals Processing Fund that's going to have $500 million in it. And again, that's meant to help companies process the minerals here that are being mined here. Right. And so that money will help construct new facilities or ones that already exist, make sure that they're operating at maximum capacity. And then there's a number of other measures connected to the critical minerals industry, and in particular involving Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario with some of these projects. We've been hearing Doug Ford talk a lot about the Ring of Fire and projects like that. And there, again, he was calling on Ottawa, or the finance minister was today anyway, in his speech in the legislature, calling on Ottawa to help remove red tape and bureaucracy. He was saying when it comes to resource development projects, he specifically called on Ottawa to scrap Bill C-69. Right. He said he's spoken to Finance Minister Francois-Philippe Champagne this morning and some other of the new cabinet picks, and he looks forward to working with them on some of these projects, David.
Okay, Megan, thank you so much. That's the CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick at Queen's Park. So Ontario now has its post-election budget, laying out its fiscal plan as it deals with U.S. President Donald Trump and his unpredictable trade war. Not something we're going to see from the federal government anytime soon. As yesterday, Finance Minister Francois-Philippe Champagne said Canadians will get an economic update in the fall, but not necessarily a budget. And today, the Conservative and Bloc Québécois leaders reacted to that decision.
Mr. Carney said during the election campaign that he had a plan. And he took great delight in saying that a slogan is not a plan. Well, a budget is a plan. And if he does indeed have a plan, if he does know what he's doing, then he would introduce a budget so that Canadians know exactly what the finances are.
They expect, as we said we would provide our collaboration, they must not expect the population or us to say, okay, do whatever you want, explain nothing, and we will let you go with it.
Okay, I'm back with the power panel. Cameron Ahmad, Kate Harrison, Andrew Thompson, and Chachi Curl. Andrew, I feel like this and sort of our last conversation, they can tie together because you see the impact there in the numbers in Ontario from Trump, right? The growth cut in half, deficit doubled, and a whole bunch of spending in reserve to offset from it. It's pretty clear, though, what they're dealing with and how they're doing it versus sort of the bit of the incoherence we saw yesterday. And now no real clear fiscal picture from the feds until the fall. I mean, as a former finance minister, I mean, how do you view this? Is this just a process concern or is there a material impact here on government operations?
Yeah, I don't understand the strategy that they're going with here. This seems to be a missed opportunity. And you can see with the way that the Ford government has baked in a bunch of question marks. And they just don't know. We don't know what the impact is. And I think this is true across the board. We don't know what the impact is on existing industries, and there's a lot of questions about where do you put investments to drive what comes next. I thought actually the Ford government, don't hold me to this because I'll be calling them to say where's the money for the university shortly, but sure. But on balance, it was a reasonably cautious budget. And it laid out some markers, at least as to what they thought was going to happen to the economy. I think the question is, why can't the federal government do something similar? Even if there are question marks there. Now, that's not to say, and I think we've all seen, people lighting their hair on fire, concerned with, well, there's no accountability. There will still be supply motions. There will still be, the Ways and Means motions that all, lay out what the spending is. So all of that will be legal. But the question is, what's the framework it attaches to? And to say we've got to wait until the fall to see that, I do think is a missed opportunity on the part of the government to actually show that leadership, and especially the kind of leadership people expect from somebody of Mark Carney's stature.
Yeah, like Shachi, I look at this as in two ways. Right, one is the fiscal assumptions the election was run under, they don't apply anymore, right? They had a baseline from the parliamentary budget officer. Everybody used it. It was not valid even during the campaign. No one was being dishonest, but things just changed dramatically. And a budget, it also gives form to your agenda, which, going back to the message challenges, like a budget will, you have something to follow. Maybe they can't get a budget done by next month. I get that, but you can update the deficit projections, the economic forecast. You can give us those things, right?
Yeah, if you can't find your budget under the table or in the closet, you can certainly pull out a spring economic update instead. This is less about the from a public opinion standpoint, this is less about the product of a budget. On any given day, if I go into anybody, any respondent anywhere, it's like, could you tell us exactly what was in the last provincial or federal budget? There's not a lot of specific knowledge there. This is more about the vacuum of communication at a time when Canadians are already at a 10. They're way up here in terms of economic anxiety. And not having a budget takes away this government's or any government's ability to communicate, reassure, forward project and say, look, there is a plan, it exists, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this.
The throne speech will do some of that.
The throne speeches, the king is going to read it and we're all going to be talking about royalty again. To your point, it's not the specifics. And government management in the political world abhors an information vacuum. And are we really to hear, Minister Champagne and others say, yeah, we're basically going to go quiet for the better part of June, July, August into September, where the mood could potentially sour very quickly. This could be a very short honeymoon, and the compounding of we don't have a ton to say is not a safe place for any government to be.
Well, look, we will have a First Ministers meeting June 2nd in Saskatoon, then the G7 is happening in the middle of the month. Donald Trump will be here. So, I think there's going to be, from a
spending perspective, from an economic management perspective.
Yes, maybe not. But I mean, the Trump visit, that could tell us a lot about where the direction of this thing is going. So Cameron, on that, the throne speeches give direction. They often don't give specifics. So the communication style of Prime Minister Carney is very economical and blunt, versus sort of aspirational and flowery in a lot of cases. So I don't know if they get more specific in the throne speech, but what do you make of this? We might be punting a budget to 2026. The promise is for a fall economic statement, not necessarily a budget. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that is all speculation. First of all, I agree with Andrew that the strategy to not announce a budget and hold it off until the fall is difficult. Is difficult to understand. The government is going to take some hits. It is certainly a fair debate to have, and it's absolutely fair for the opposition to bring it up and to pressure them on it. At the same time, I will say that the government was elected to take very strong and quick action on the economy on two big fronts. One, on the cost of living, rise in cost of living that millions of Canadians are feeling, and two, on our relationship with the United States and our position as a trading partner vis-a-vis them and the rest of the world. On those two fronts, I don't think by any stretch the government is intending to create a vacuum or to be quiet, as you just pointed out, right? First of all, they're going to introduce a bill they've already talked about their first action being a middle-class tax cut, which will apply to millions of people. They are seeking to eliminate trade barriers between all provinces and territories by Canada Day. As you pointed out, the G7 is happening, where our biggest trading partners and allies are going to be in Canada discussing the path forward and how we deal with the trade war. And the relationship with the United States, cementing the visit that he had at the White House just a few days ago, that will occupy an enormous amount of their attention and time, rightly so, but also in the public conversation throughout the summer. So I think the economy will remain the focus. It is directly linked to what they campaigned on and why people voted for them.
Right.
And I understand the questions around the budget, though.
Kate?
Yeah, Cameron is right. Canadians voted for economic and fiscal management through uncertain times. They voted for Mark Carney more as an individual than they did as Liberal Party leader to be that person to table that plan and to lead us through the greatest crisis of our lifetime. That is his words, not mine. So to approach your early days with no plan, no budget that you're tabling, and it doesn't need to be a fixed, finite document forever, right?
But does no budget mean no plan, or does it just mean no budget?
No.
Right?
Well, I would say that if you are going to the effort of putting a costed platform together in front of Canadians, and we all sat around this table and said how important it was to have a costed platform, and we all talked about how challenging it was because of so many uncertainties, why can't you do the same thing for a budget? Finance Canada has been at work ever since Justin Trudeau abdicated his responsibility as Prime Minister. Where is it? Like Francois Philippe Champagne was working on it. Again, this doesn't need to be a 400, 500-page document, but Canadians elected this Prime Minister in particular to guide us through these economically uncertain times, to say, we'll get back to you in 4 months, is an abdication of leadership.
I think the temperature's a little bit higher. This is exacerbated in part as well because we have not had a budget in more than a year.
Yes.
And so, you know, had we seen a budget tabled in an earlier part of the year, had we seen a budget in February, I think this conversation and the temperature around it would be a lot lower. And I think there would be a lot more, at least in terms of the early reaction or the early criticism, I think there'd be a lot more leeway to say, look, you know, we've been through some unprecedented times. We need time to figure our stuff out. It's been 13 months. I think that is amping this.
April 16th, last year was the last budget, but sorry, I'm going to get you, Andrew. The argument, Adam Chambers made it earlier, like Stephen Harper won an election January 23rd, 2006. He was sworn in as Prime Minister February 6th. No budget until the 2nd of May. Right, so that was like 3 months on, right? So you know, I don't know if that means August or September for Canadians, but yeah, I mean, did that mean there was no plan then? I don't know.
And again, people are, you know, I think somewhere in between this is where the expectations are. I mean, I get what Cameron's laying out, but I mean, government by issue management isn't, you know, optimal. I mean, simply going from headline to headline, from crisis to crisis, isn't what you want to be projecting. On the other hand, I don't think it is the end of the world in terms of not coming forward with your spending projections when you're going to be tabling supply bills that do exactly that anyway. The bigger problem is that you're not putting a marker down as to what's going to happen on the economy. Now, I think one of the reasons for that, and it's interesting, is that they really are right now, and maybe this is Mark Carney's style, spending a lot of time, from what I can tell, to talk to industry, to talk to business leaders, to try to figure out what is it we do next. Because I think there is a realization that this economy is in transition. We are not just compressing and going back to, you know, what was there. The economy is now fundamentally going to change. And I think what Carney is probably wanting to do is when he does come forward and say something authoritatively, that it can be definitive and he can set that direction. The problem is it's a great big vacuum and it's a huge political gamble to take in this 4 or 5 months.
It is also uncertainty for provinces and territories, like we saw in Ontario's comments today, to try and have their own fiscal projections. And I would say to investors as well, who are watching Canada with great interest. They want to see what this new government is going to do in the early days. And so to not have one of the foundational economic documents to consider when you are making these investment decisions, you can understand why investors might be looking with Canada with some skepticism.
But would a throne speech and the supplementary estimates and the platform be enough for them to piece together directionality?
I think that some transparency in the books as they exist today would be necessary for Canadians and investors and companies to look at Canada and make a judgment call about whether or not we're a worthwhile place to do investment. I doubt the throne speech will have that kind of detail. To my knowledge, none ever have in the past.
No, but who knows? The king has given this one, so it's a whole different ballgame.
Would it be flowery?
I don't know. There's been nothing flowery about Carney's written and uttered statements, and I don't know if they do it with the king just because it's royalty. I don't know. We'll see. Cameron, last word to you. How do you manage this message-wise without sort of having that clear document? And if the throne speech is sort of like flowery and non-specific, you know, what's the compass point you point to when people say, where are you going with this?
Okay, 2 things. One, I don't think that the thrones. Well, first of all, I don't want to speculate on the throne speech. I'm going to, other than to say, I imagine it's going to be closely related to the platform that
I would expect
that they put out. Firstly, I wasn't saying that the government is intending to run its first few months based on issues management. I was saying that the things that they ran on the economy, sound economic management, and responding to the tariff war is what is going to dominate their focus for the next few months, regardless. It's the first major thing that the Prime Minister did, and it's going to take an enormous amount of focus for his entire team and the majority of his cabinet and all the people around him and himself to get that right. It was a good start from his first meeting. He's going to keep having to spend an enormous amount of time on it. And the second thing is, putting together a budget is a long, complex process that involves hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions. You don't want to, I understand the argument that they could put something smaller out, just sort of a fiscal state of affairs for Canada. But if you want to put out a thorough budget that does give investors and the rest of the world that confident state of how Canada's doing, it does take time. And Mark Carney is a new Prime Minister who is deliberately signaling that he wants to do things differently and has a plan that is different from the previous government. So you can't expect something like that to be produced and prepared in a couple weeks.
Okay. I got 20 seconds. I see you. Then I got to go because I've gone over time.
I don't think Canadians are expecting or demanding a rush job out of a brand new government. I think they're prepared to give some time. It's just a matter of like, hey, there are certain markers you need to meet as government, and I just think the communication around what they're intending to do and leaving the door wide open for us to keep talking about this. Probably
if not a budget, a balance sheet, right?
Yeah.
If not a budget, at least a balance sheet.
And look, I think every government in the world is running on issues management right now, and the issue is Trump. You got to manage that one or else.